Good evening. Welcome, as always, to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and on Facebook. My name is Robin Browne, and I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. And I'm delighted to be joined by my co-host, Libby Davies, for tonight's Off the Hill political panel.
Well, thank you, Robin, and it's great to be back co-hosting with you. And I'm joining you tonight from the traditional territory of the Squamish people, which is also known as Gambier Island.
Fantastic. And I am glad to be here with our panelists tonight for a debrief on the federal election and a look forward to what is ahead. Tonight we are joined by Leah Gazan. Hello, Leah, MP for Winnipeg Centre. Welcome back and congratulations on your re-election.
Thank you.
No problem. Chuka Ejeckham, welcome back, Chuka. Chuka is a political researcher and writer from British Columbia. Good to have you back, Chuka. Rachel Snow, welcome back, Rachel. Rachel is Yahai Nakota. She holds a Juris Doctor from the College of Law, University of Saskatchewan, and is an outspoken educator, speaker, writer, and co-contact person for the Indigenous Activist Network. Rachel resides on her ancestral lands in Minisni, west of Calgary, Alberta. And last but not least, Karl Nerenberg. Welcome, Karl. Karl is an award-winning journalist, broadcaster, and filmmaker who works in both English and French. And he joined Rabble as parliamentary correspondent in 2011. So thank you to all our panelists, and over to you, Libby.
All right, well, let's begin. For those of you who are watching on Zoom, you can participate in the chat and ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function. So we hope you'll do that. And we'll certainly do our very best to get to the questions that folks have. For those of you who are watching on Facebook, we certainly welcome you. Well, let's get down to it. We've had much discussion at previous panels of Off the Hill about what we're now calling the pandemic election and the critical issues facing us. And here we are after the election, a $600 million full circle back to where we were. So before we move on to what's ahead for Canadians in this latest minority parliament, I want to briefly give each of our panelists an opportunity to give your thoughts and reflections about the election result overall. And Leah, I'm going to start with you because you were re-elected, which is fabulous. Congratulations on a great campaign. So good to see you back. How do things look for the NDP after the election? Let's begin with that.
Well, thanks so much. And it's always a pleasure to be on this panel, Libby. And, welcome to all the distinguished speakers tonight. I look forward to a rich discussion. I mean, it's no doubt it's certainly disappointing. We went into the election. I think we were hoping to get more gains. We did gain one more seat. I think certainly for all parties, this current government spent $612 million on a pandemic election, an unnecessary election. That's certainly what I heard going door to door to door. We're in the same place we were prior to the election being called. People at this juncture, people are feeling insecure. We have job insecurity, housing insecurity in the midst of the pandemic. Crises did not end, for example, and promises that this government has been promising for a while still haven't happened. Universal child care. They could have put that in. They called an election. Clean drinking water. We now know in Iqaluit, they're having a crisis because of, leaks, gas leaks in water. I mean, we could have spent the time working on making sure people are looked after. Certainly it's disappointing. I think most disappointing, though, is the fact that they called an election in the first place, an election that was critically unnecessary during a time where we should be working to ensure that people are getting what they need. This government has failed.
Yeah. Leah, you mentioned that, the election result for the NDP, and it was just one extra seat, despite the fact that there was so many ridings. It was a very close call. So, Karl, over to you. I know you wrote an article, I think it was just today, actually, on Rabble, particularly about Toronto and how the first past the post in terms of the election result absolutely is not reflecting the way people voted. So any reflections from you, and then we'll jump in with Chuka and Rachel on what this election was about in terms of that result.
So the idea of reforming our electoral system seems to be dead after Justin Trudeau promised it solemnly and kept repeating that promise hundreds of times. He just decided, he said, oh, I'm not going to worry about ticking a box on my electoral program. It was a lot more than that. And when he decided that it didn't serve his party's interests, he abandoned the idea. And people like me, I think it's part of our responsibility to keep that idea alive and to say that the way the first past the post system works, it's not just that it's terribly unfair to a party like the NDP and the NDP supporters. You have a case where the Liberals got 47 point some percent of the seats in Parliament, almost half of them, with not even a third of the votes, whereas the NDP got fewer than 8% of the seats in Parliament, with 17.8% of the votes, twice as many in proportion votes as seats. I know it's always a numbers game and who really cares about numbers, but what's more striking is that our system makes it seem like region by region, city by city, province by province, we are more uniform and in our political views and political allegiances than we are. Toronto has 90% of the 43 seats, and I think it's 53 seats in Toronto, larger Toronto, greater Toronto. Correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not remembering the exact numbers, but 90% went to the Liberals. But the Liberals didn't even get half the votes. Mm-hmm. The Conservatives managed to get 5 seats, which, to give the Conservatives credit, is far lower than their popular vote. But the NDP got zero, not a single seat in the entire Greater Toronto area. Same with Saskatchewan. In Saskatchewan, again, just talking about the NDP, we could talk about other parties, but the NDP had more than 1 in 5 people in Saskatchewan voted for the New Democrats. And what did they get for their trouble? 0, not a single member. So it makes it seem like that Saskatchewan is like 100%, every single person you're going to ever meet in Saskatchewan is 100% conservative, and 9 people out of 10 in Toronto are a total 100% liberal, and it's a lie in both cases, and it's not good for Canada. It's not good for Canada to divide us that way. The one party that benefits from this, really benefits, is the Separatist Party in Quebec, which is the one party that says, we don't even care about the other provinces. We only care about Quebec. We only run members in Quebec. They once did so well under this system that they became the official opposition. Libby will remember that in 1993.
Let's bring in Rachel and Chuka on this. So just quickly, any sort of overall thoughts or reflections? It was fascinating to hear from both of you during the election, and the panels that we had, what your observations were. How do you feel about it now when you see the result that we got? Rachel, why don't we start with you, and then we'll hear from Chuka.
Good afternoon, everyone. Today. I think, I said this at our last, when we did our last political discussion. I said, I doubt there's going to be very much change. And I also said that I don't think there will be a majority government. I don't think there's one party that's clearly going to come ahead in any of this. And I've heard, about the colossal waste, yes, but again, I think it's compounded by the fact that our people have really no representation at in the existing federal government structure. We're consistently fighting against that structure. So like I was saying before, throughout the discussions, I've been standing kind of apart saying, I'm not going to vote. And I still believe this is a settler government system that is a foreign government on our land. So what is the purpose of us participating in the vote? Because where we should be participating, if we're sovereign thinking individuals, we should be arguing at that point from the nation to nation. And that's what nation to nation means, is that if we understand that we are nations and that we are representing our people or the specific interests that have continued since before the settlers came, before treaty, during treaty and after, if we understand that perspective, that this is who we are as First Nation people, we don't participate in those programs. We advocate from the level, from the spiritual connection we have to the land, or from our positions, our traditional hereditary leadership positions. So that's still my position. I think it was an interesting election. I don't know. You get what you paid for. Yeah, like, so stuff happened. It really doesn't affect us.
Chuka.
Thanks, Libby. I'm joining you all today from the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. One thing that has stuck out to me, I think, is what I would say is the pretty dismal state of a lot of the major media outlets in Canada, and perhaps most shamefully, the public broadcaster. I think that a lot of the coverage that we saw in the election, again, there are, a lot of great journalists doing great work, but again, I'm talking about the sort of major media outlets, often called legacy outlets. I think a lot of the coverage that we saw just has no meaningful thought in it. There's the ex-politician says Y in location Z, and that's the entire story. There's a number of things, for example, that Trudeau said that were never validated nor questioned further. He pledged support for the people of Haiti, never came up again in the election. He was never asked about it. He spoke only of helping. He spoke only of helping Afghan allies to Canada, as opposed to considering that we supported, and through our association with the United States, supported and cheerleaded 20 years of bloodthirsty imperialism in that country. Of course, did never mention none of the coverage of his comments on Haiti mentioned the relationship between Canada and Haiti. And then even, of course, his description of the election as Canadians have to decide, right? Not that, of course, doesn't, in his conception, that doesn't mean participatory budgeting. It doesn't mean citizens' assemblies. It doesn't mean any measure of meaningful democracy. It just means a sort of pantomime thing that we do every few years, which doesn't produce any more representative results. But he gets to say, "Well, they chose me." I wish that there was a lot more critical and kind of oppositional coverage of liberal politicians in particular.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue into our next question, Chuka, because when you describe the pantomime, I think there is a sense of frustration and disappointment with the political scene in Canada. In fact, you've all reflected that in different levels just here today. It's almost a tiredness and even an anger that we've been let down on so many fronts. So I guess my question is for you to think about and to share with us is what needs to change in the political landscape? I mean, Chuka, you've talked about the media coverage, but what needs to change as well to constructively engage people? What could any of you name that could help restore people's confidence in the political process and the changes we'd all like to see? What could be done differently? What is realistically, I mean, we can dream, so big ideas are good too, but what constructively can we do to change that engagement and that sense that people maybe would have some confidence in the political process? Who'd like to begin on that one and jump in?
I can go quickly.
Yep.
I think, there are participatory measures of democracy that can be used, like, again, participatory budgeting I just mentioned, but also participatory agenda setting, citizens assemblies, enduring citizens assemblies in which people from communities are encouraged and sort of financially supported in sort of coming together, just deliberating on particular political issues, and then setting forward proposals for the sort of larger community to vote on, and then ensuring that that everyone in the community has is sort of rotating through that membership on a regular basis, so that it is truly participatory. But one thing I think is that I think would be, or certainly would be helpful to me, would be a much greater time horizon on the way we talk about politics. Like, even on the issue of climate, we can project, the next century, the next 2 centuries, and the things that we'll have to contend with, but we never have political discussions about what we are going to do in the next 2 centuries. We never talk about this thing that we have made and what it's for and what we wish to do with it. What do we want to be as a species, as intermingling organisms, as living creatures constantly coming into contact with one another. We never talk about those things. We always, it always gets sort of, it's I think that sort of thing is a meaningful conversation about like how you can exercise political power in your direct community, but then also overall, like what is this for? What do you want? That I mean, perhaps those are fanciful, but I think maybe they could help.
I don't think they're fanciful at all. I think we got to grab them and try and run with it. Leah.
So just building on what Chuka was saying, like we're in the midst of a climate disaster. We're in a climate crisis, not even on the radar during this election. We're in a time where we see a growing corporate dictatorship, where the privileges of corporations are supersede the human rights of people. Wet'suwet'en territory, for example. The old growth, like what we're seeing out in BC, the Mi'kmaq fisheries. I mean, like we are in a critical juncture, and we are not even addressing the issues that matter most to people. Like our very survival depends on it. Barely even a topic during the election, but just from like a personal experience as somebody that's in this space, this colonial space. I ran a campaign, not a negative campaign. I didn't run about what the Liberals weren't doing, what the Conservatives, I didn't even mention them during my campaign. I stood on, what I believe in, what I'm running for, what I'm committing to, and what I have accomplished, and what I'm going to continue to work for. I think people are sick and tired of this politic that focuses on the lesser of evils, and people want to know what you're going to do as an elected official to change the world in the middle of a crisis. There was never a time, I mean, I had a very nice academic career before deciding to enter politics. It was a really nice life. Part of the reason I decided to enter this arena is because I am worried about the climate emergency. I am worried about the growing corporate dictatorship, and I don't think I'm alone in that. Like there are people going Amazon, Bezos. I mean, William Shatner was flown up to space in the middle of all of this. There's more and more people, certainly in my riding, that are flowing onto the streets, that are becoming unsheltered for the very first time. And I think the politics needs to focus on people. I think, doing this flashy talk, being smooth doesn't work anymore. People want somebody who's honest, and they want somebody who's going to give you the straight goods. I had 50% of the vote this time, 50% of the vote of people who liked me, and 50% of the vote of people who didn't agree with me, but at least they know what they're voting for. And I think that's what the electorate is looking for at this point.
Thanks, Leah. And Rachel, any thoughts from you about how we can sort of change that political landscape in terms of finding ways to constructively engage with people so that we can influence what's going on?
Well, I think Chuka mentioned most of the ways you can change, or you can look at certainly the existing federal government and make changes in that system. But I also think that again, this is a colonial system inherited from Great Britain that's being brought over here to our territory, to our community, to our land. So it's a foreign government. So I don't know how effective it is going to be, because it's not the true governance system of the land. I think for myself, I'd like to know, I'd like to go back right to the beginning of the history and talk about the Indian Trust Fund, talk about the billions, trillions that were supposedly invested into that fund that's been keeping all of Canada alive. And let's break that down, and let's get a forensic audit on that. Let's get an accounting of that and start there, so that we have people understanding that it's not an entitlement to live in this land. They're actually very lucky that we allowed people to take part and be part of our human family here in North America. So I think that if we want to stop, I agree with what Chuka says, a lot of it, but I think in order for that to happen, you have to have people who want to work together. And when you have a system that is built on competition, a system that is built on right and wrong and adversarial justice system, all the things that stand in the way, you're not going to have that happen. You're not going to have this kumbaya, rosy, overnight thing happen. But what you can start to do is, again, like finding the 215 children, actually making that sense of entitlement, actually putting down the correct history of what actually happened, the genocide and the theft of land. If we start talking from that point, maybe people will feel less entitled and less like they're entitled to take or do whatever they want in this land, including destroying the climate and just with myopic vision going forward with these ridiculous developments that are costing more and more and doing nothing except for a few, fat bigwigs wherever they are, and tax those guys. If we start doing some of these things, I think that's when you're going to start to find the attitude change or the change in thinking, so that people stop thinking for myself and stop talking about me and start talking about we.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And Karl, just some thoughts from you on how we can find that sort of way to constructively engage with people.
I will be very, very non-ambitious and very, very modest. Rachel talked about a system based on competition is ultimately dysfunctional or something like that. I'm reinterpreting the words, is not constructive. So I would like for Parliament, just to look at Parliament itself, since we're focusing somewhat on that, to accept that there are 338 members of Parliament. They come from different parties. They represent different views and interests in society. They're not an exact representation of what people voted for, but they're there. And despite all despite the wishes of the party that wanted to have all the power, in a way we're at least fortunate we didn't get a majority government. And to start treating this kind of parliament and this kind of minority government, or not even call it a minority government, to start treating this kind of parliament as normal, reasonable, real, and to say it is not an opportunity for the party that gets in power to try to manipulate the situation and see when it can leap and get itself all the power. It's an opportunity to share the power, to cooperate, to work together. We're not going to see a coalition cabinet when Trudeau announces his cabinet on the 25th. So that's off the table, but that doesn't mean there can't be constructive cooperation. It didn't start well when you had the leader of the NDP and it was the NDP on which the Liberals depended for most of their support to get their legislation through in the last parliament, when the leader of the NDP had to say, the phone's not ringing, I'm here, hello, I'm your partner, we're in league together. Okay, I only have 25 seats, but I had more than half of your votes. The votes that I got, the people who voted for me, you're not even double. You're way more than double my seats, but you're not double my supporters. You're not even anywhere near that. So I think that's what I'm wishing for, is that the media as well, my colleagues, stop treating what we call a minority parliament or a hung parliament or a parliament in which there's a variety of parties and nobody has a majority as a freak thing, as a bad thing, as an abnormal thing, as a temporary thing, as a disease. It's not. It's the democratic will of the people, however imperfectly expressed, that got us here. Let's make it work.
Actually, that is a great segue into our next question, actually, Karl. So we've just had a great discussion about some of the changes we'd like to see to the system, but as you pointed out, at the moment, we're stuck with the current system. It produced a minority parliament. Now, the history actually shows that minority parliaments have actually produced some pretty good things for Canadians. In fact, I just wrote a blog post about some of the history of what they've produced for Black people, and it's actually been pretty good. So, for example, a minority parliament brought us universal public health care, right? So what we want to focus. So, the question is, this minority parliament, I believe, and maybe Karl, you can answer this, is highly unusual in that there's a lot of pressure for this minority parliament to last for 4 years, right? If Trudeau tries to call another election in 2 years, or if any party tries to bring them down, that not right. So the question is, so what can people do beyond the election now to actually influence what's happening, given it's a minority parliament? And let's start actually with Rachel, considering, Rachel, that you see the system's kind of illegitimate, but what are your thoughts?
How to make an illegitimate system legitimate? Is that what you're at? Are you trying to, like, swing me in that direction that I would actually say? You know what I think? I think what makes me laugh is that Canada has this idea of federalism that is in a British statute. Their division of powers comes from, whatever the lords in London were, messing around that day and said, oh yeah, give them the railroad, give them health, ha 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 ha. And that's where we are in Canada. Like, I mean, that's what we base our system on, or that's what the federal government is basing their system on, the Canadians. So I think it's hilarious that their actual government is not even their own sovereign government. It was a colonial process that was handed over to them. And yet they talk to us as though they're the creators, and as though they have, the pulse of the people and the land on their radar, which they don't. And I wanted to say something about the CCF or the NDP. So my contention is this again, that when first settlers were coming out west and they moved the Native people onto reserves, at that time, in the Indian Act 1876, they had stipulations that our people could not sell their wheat or their grains, anything that they were making, until the non-First Nations sold their things first. This is in Daschek's book, Clearing the Plains. But what my idea is that the First Nations all work together. They went from, because we're related and because you help each other. So they went from area to area harvesting, and they helped one another. And they were ready with their grain far quickly than the regular farmer, at the next field. And so they were held back with that because they actually had continued the system of working together and made it profitable, or translated that into a bigger picture. When they did that, I think the non-First Nations kind of looked and said, hey, look, these idiot, stupid Indians can work together. I'm pretty sure we can. And that is the roots of why there's even this idea in Canada. I'm saying this because somebody said, well, where's the citation for that? And I said, I haven't written it yet. But I think that there are many things that come from the way that our people are. If you think about the First Nations, some are coastal people, some are plains people, some are woodland people. And there's the distinctiveness of our character, of our language, and of our relationship to the land. That's the same thing that's happening to Canada, because you are in our territory. So reconcile all that.
Thank you, Rachel. Let's go to Leah. Leah, what do you think? We have minority parliament. Look, again, a lot of pressure for this to be around for 4 years. How can people actually influence it?
Well, minority parliaments are horrific for elected representatives, because you're in an election every 2 minutes. And let me tell you, I'm pretty tired. So I've had like back-to-back elections. But I do think minority parliaments work. I mean, I'm a new MP. I was elected 2 years ago. I think because we were in a minority parliament, that's how I got millions of dollars in housing for our community. That's how we got money for women's programs, because it opens up the door to force people to work across the way. I think politics is too much about power and not enough about people. I think there's a disconnect between people and power, and the whole focus in Ottawa is around maintaining power, keeping power. It's all about power. The people don't fit in that place at all. So, minority governments, I think, are humbling. It forces people to have to take a step back. It forces individuals, elected individuals, to take a step back and work across the way. But I just want to go from there to talk about movement building. I think people focus too much on politics. I don't think politicians matter. In fact, I've often said I'm probably the most unimportant person, because my whole life depends on a vote. That's not very powerful when your fate depends on a vote. I think right now we're at a time, we had in the NDP, for example, we had several movement candidates, Abby Lewis, and Angeli from BC, Bravo from Toronto, Paul Taylor. Like, we have a number of people that are from the movement that are trying to get in these spaces to bring the movement on the outside on the inside to the outside and have that a communication. I think we're at a time of movements. I think we can talk about minority governments, majority governments, but it's the movement that's really changing things on the ground. And it's movements that force change in Parliament because people want to get reelected. And if they know their decision is going to prevent them from getting power, it shifts systems. And I think a good example, for example, in the last election, I ran a whole campaign with the movement, with the Basic Income Manitoba, Basic Income Canada, basic income groups around the country to put in place a guaranteed livable basic income. We have income guarantees in this country right now, not livable. 55,000 signatures. It's now part of the NDP platform. The Green Party certainly has run on it. And it's becoming part of the political discourse because people shouldn't be living on the streets, especially Indigenous people. This is our land. We're homeless on our own lands. We shouldn't be poor on our own lands. And so I don't think that was the result of work that I did. That was the result of the movement pushing and me bringing the voice on the inside. So I think you can do those things, particularly in a minority parliament. You can push that discussion. So, I'm not looking forward to an election in the next 18 months probably again, but I'm looking forward to pushing the agenda in the House of Commons.
No, thanks, Leah. Actually, I want to go to Chuka next, but just a quick question for Leah, seeing as you are an MP. So the blog post I talked about said, minority parliaments have been great for Black people. We got one now. Black people can push. Now, in terms of the pushing, one of the things that we were talking about doing is like writing letters to MPs and that kind of stuff to get them to work on issues. Does that work? Quick answer.
No, just kidding. It absolutely does work. I think using multiple platforms. I joke because my emails explode around certain issues, but it absolutely does put issues on the radar. It absolutely works. Boots to ground action works. Having a coordinated effort between elected officials and people on the ground absolutely works. And I think, publishing, walking, I think you need to use multiple tools to have any sort of shifts in systems. I support all tools, even frontline action, particularly around the climate emergency.
Excellent. Thanks, Leah. Okay, Chuck, over to you. Again, minority parliament. We're asking, we got a minority parliament. What can people do to influence it?
Yeah, I mean, I would defer to what Leah said about prioritizing social movements. I think that, again, all of the candidates that you mentioned, I was particularly inspired by the way that they felt their running for office was a culmination of their involvement in social movements and movement politics, as opposed to their understanding of politics as distinct from social movements, which I think we have far too much of overall. So yeah, I mean, that seems to be the thing. And I while the goal, of course, is the ultimate dissolution of this state and all others, it does seem that it would be useful to have the capacities of the state to deal with some of these grand globe spawning crises, like the climate crisis, the dictatorship or the corporate capitalist dictatorship, which I think Leah has very, very accurately described. And so it does seem that it would be useful to have the capacities of governments, of federal governments, to deal with those things. But then, if the governments themselves have no desire to deal with those things, it does seem that we will have to build more localized or regional networks of durability, basically, of you could call it mutual aid, but it seems that will be necessary. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Chuka. Now I see time is flying here, so Karl, I'd like to get your thoughts on this quickly, and that point of is this an unusual minority parliament in terms of the pressure that there is now on this to last for 4 years?
I'm not so sure 4 years. I'm not so sure they're going to feel that pressure all the way through for 4 years, but there's a pressure not to constantly play brinksmanship. The other minority parliaments, like the minute the parliament starts, the whole exercise is, okay, if we don't get our way, we're going to see when we can have an election right away. Just spring an election on all you guys and see how you like that. And they would often like threaten other parties, especially a party that depends on grassroots donations like the NDP. Oh, you don't have our money. You know, we're gonna come at you when you don't have enough money. They would say you don't want an election because you don't have money. But the fact is that given the fact that we're talking about the communication between social movements, people in the street, people out in the community, and politicians, there are areas where tangible legislative areas where we should look for the possibility for pushing for change. We know we're going to get the child care program, whatever we think of it. It's already in the works. So we'll leave that on the side. I mean, Judy Rebick says that's as big and important for women's rights as the right to abortion. Now we have precarious workers. The Liberal government's only played around the edges, but you're going to get big pushback. Today, the C.D. Howe Institute put out a paper saying there's basically no way to extend any kind of employment insurance to precarious workers, bad for the economy. And those people have sway and influence. They're not just influencing the Conservatives. They're a Toronto-based, mainstream, well-funded organization. The Liberals listen to them. So you have to push the other way. Indigenous sovereignty, a much bigger issue. I mean, I'm waiting for somebody to take out the 1996 Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples to say, let's start making this real. Because it's one micro, I would like to hear from our Indigenous friends here on the panel. One micro suggestion that Royal Commission had is we ought to have, as New Zealand does, guaranteed Indigenous members of Parliament. So you don't get a situation where the Indigenous people are a minority in many, many ridings across country. Kenora is an example. Early in the evening on election night, the Indigenous and NDP candidate was winning Kenora because the votes were coming from those communities. And Leah pointed out before we came out of the air, some of those communities couldn't even vote. They didn't even have ballot stations. So that might be a way of guaranteeing some kind of Indigenous participation in Parliament. And then finally, global responsibility. And we heard from Chuka about that. In particular, again, former colleague of Libby's and a colleague of Leah's, Don Davies, is pushing the government now to side with developing countries such as South Africa and India to say that we should lift the patent protection on vaccines so that the vaccines can be manufactured cheaply in developing countries so the whole world can have vaccines before we in the rich West get our third vaccine. So those are areas where there could be cooperation between people in the community in the street and people in Parliament, targeted areas.
Okay, actually, Carl, that's a great segue into our next question because you hit on some issues. So we've talked previously about a just pandemic recovery, a recovery that reflects the seismic changes that we've all experienced, especially people in, I guess, as Carl was talking about, in precarious and high-risk situations, and whether through income, work, health, or systemic racism. The new government will soon lay out its priorities in the speech from the throne, right? And ultimately will lay them out in a budget. What do we want to see, or what do you want to see in this speech from the throne? Let's start actually with Leah.
Thank you so much for the question. I think it's important that we recognize that, certainly during the pandemic, people who were far behind before the pandemic or even further behind. I think, as much as we talk about Indigenous, non-Indigenous, there's certain things that most of the electorate agrees upon. There is a growing amount of a pressure for the federal government to respect fundamental Indigenous human rights, whether it's access to clean drinking water, whether it's housing, whether it's schools, whether it's honoring the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal ruling, or matters around resource extraction and the continual violent violation of fundamental Indigenous human rights. Let's look at Iqaluit. The water, why is it contaminated? Because of rickshaw resource companies that come on to Indigenous territories and pollute our lands and resources and impede on our rights to live off the land, our rights to hunt and fish, all of these rights that we signed on to in treaties. I think there's a growing recognition of that. And the fact that poverty in this country is one of the most violent human rights violations. The fact that people in my riding freeze to death in bus shacks, and the fact that at that very same moment, there's people like Jeff Bezos that are flying into space off because they get off the hook on things like, in offshore tax havens and taxing the ultra rich and going after corporations and what I call a growing corporate dictatorship. I want to see something in this throne speech that addresses real inequalities, because we can talk about systemic racism, but unless we are willing to really tackle the things that are keeping people beside this incremental justice that just informs most decisions in the House of Commons, we are not going to see substantive change. And that's why I do think it matters. I think representation in Parliament matters. I think having strong voices in Parliament matters, because if we are not there, these issues are not discussed. The fact that I would have loved to see Avi Lewis there, Angeli, Alejandra Bravo, Paul Taylor in the House of Commons around our caucus table fighting on these critical matters, because our voices around social justice in that place, in that colonial, violent, racist cesspool, are few and far between. So representation matters. I want to see something like that spoken about in the throne speech. I think I'll be thoroughly disappointed, but I'm going to keep fighting.
Thanks, Leah. Chuka, what do you want to see? What do you want to see in the throne speech?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly expect to be disappointed as well. But I think that one thing that kind of came up throughout the pandemic was, given that most offices were shut down and things like that, not with sort of workers deemed to be essential notwithstanding, I think there was, which is somewhat being evidenced now in the sort of wave of strikes that we're seeing across the US, and what people have called the Great Resignation, people just deciding not to return to work and whatnot. I think there's a confronting that most of the shit that we spend our life doing actually kind of sucks and is both awful and unnecessary. And we shouldn't spend our lives doing things that we don't want to do, and also don't create any meaningful benefit for anyone other than the profiteers. I think that is a wonderful thing, a wonderful sentiment to stoke. And I would love to see a platform that ultimately recognizes that, the things that we've all of these sort of euphemisms that we've constructed our world, our idea of politics around, like the economy and and getting people back to work and sort of dynamism in the labor market or whatever, all that stuff is just like drivel, basically, and ensuring that everybody has everything that they need to live a sort of fully realized, self-actualized human life in which they're able to pursue their dreams and themselves is the only thing that matters. Everything else is silly. I would love to see a platform that recognizes that and recognizes that applies to everybody in the world, not just us. But I won't hold my breath.
Hey, Jack. Rachel, do you care to comment on what should be in the throne speech, or do you care?
I don't think there's going to be very much in it. I would wish there would be an admission that Canada lives on stolen land, and that we've taken all the resources and benefits from the original people without proper compensation. And then from there, I think, they can say whatever else they're going to do for whatever they're going to do. And I really disagree, Leah, about representation in that system. Because I think if we're sovereign nations, we should be working nation to nation. We should be standing on our own. We should be standing on our ancestors, what they had advocated for us to do. And so we should be standing with the power and the strength of our laws. And I'm saying right now, that's what's happening. If you really look at the government, if you really look at this sort of what is the minority government that's crumbling, and there's only this piece here and this piece there, and they don't quite have the majority, the strength of arms to just bully everybody else in a governmental dictatorship. I think that is reflective of the power of the land. And we don't talk about human rights as Indigenous people or as First Nation people. We talk about creation and our relationship to the land, because we don't have any rights until we acknowledge the rights of creation. So that's something that's very important, and why original First Nation people would not stand with the UNDRIP because we talk about the relationship to land and our spirituality. It's not just about human rights. It's about animal rights. It's about the land. And that includes climate change and everything else that we're talking about. It's a much bigger picture. And if we actually followed the Indigenous laws and Indigenous knowledge bases and our traditional ways of knowing, we'd understand that we've had the proper system for this land the entire time. The governance system that is consensus-based, that is willing to help one another, that is not adversarial. The non-systems of racism where we were inclusive, even in allowing and bringing in the settlers and, you know, round dancing and singing Kumbaya with them. If people can understand that the original governance systems and the original thinking, our worldview here in Canada or in pre-Canada, in Turtle Island was already in place. If they would understand that, the whole world would be a much better place. And on your question, Karl, those seats in the House of New Zealand, I think they're just like those seats that those guys have in Sesame Street where they sit in the peanut gallery. Those are those kinds of seats. I think they really don't have. They get elected in there, they sit in there, but they don't really have any power or say. So I guess we already have that going.
Thank you all for that on the issues. Libby, over to you.
Yeah, Robin, I know time's getting short. We want to hear from questions from people who are tuning in, but I want to just quickly sneak in a very quick and maybe a bit of a whimsical question, and make your answers real short, please. I want you to imagine that each of you gets 15 minutes, say, with each party leader, one-on-one. What advice would you give them? Fast, what advice? Karl, let's start with you.
So first of all, I'd give the same advice to both Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, which is to both of you stop playing the image game and start talking about what you actually believe in and what you actually could do and would do. Okay. And I would say to Justin Trudeau in particular, you promised electoral reform. You never explain why you're not going to do it. You better do it. And I'd say to Jagmeet Singh, whenever you get a chance to talk about policy, you can leave some of those homey little stories about some person you met in Hamilton aside and say what you actually propose, what particular programs you propose, and explain them. Have respect for the intelligence of your listeners, that they'll understand it.
Good advice. Rachel, what advice would you offer to each or any of the party leaders if you had them alone, one-on-one?
For one thing, stop with the generic land recognitions. Just say we're on stolen land. That helps a lot. That sets the stage a lot quicker. And stop lying about reconciliation, and stop talking to the parroted voices that you've so carefully cloned to be agreeing and nodding by the side of the fort with the decisions that you're making that are actually hurting us on the ground. Okay, thanks, Chuka.
Yeah, I have very little interest in speaking to Justin Trudeau or Erin O'Toole, so I don't know that I would sit down with them. If I did, I would simply ask them what they feel it is acceptable for people to profit off of that other people need. And as for Singh, I've never I've never run a political campaign, never been a party leader, or never been an elected official, let alone party leader. So I would more ask I would ask if he'd considered making the wealth tax the condition of supporting the Liberals.
Okay, good one. Leah, last word to you.
I do get that privilege. And what I would say is that people need to start making decisions on human rights. I know my good friend Rachel indicated that Indigenous people, we haven't stood behind human rights. I would beg to differ. My good sister Ellen Gabriel, for example, has stood up for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Article 5 particularly of the United Nations Declaration on Indigenous people that indicates Indigenous people have a right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. I think it's an overreaching human rights document, certainly protecting the rights that I absolutely agree with Rachel that we need to uphold, rights that are violated consistently in the House of Commons. I think it's time for this whole government structure to really uphold the Canadian Constitution, to truly uphold the rule of law. And that includes the human rights and the rights of all peoples, including Indigenous peoples, upholding treaties, and ensuring that everybody in this country can live in dignity. That is what we sign on for. That is what we take an oath of office, assuring that we will uphold this. It's time for elected officials to uphold that.
Okay, back to you, Robin.
Okay, thanks, Libby. Thanks, everybody. All right, well, and that's been a fantastic discussion of our kind of our questions we had already. But now we're going to take some audience questions. This first question, I'm going to make the executive decision that it's a bit focused on party politics. So Leah will kick out of this one just to protect you. Rachel, if you want to weigh in, okay, but definitely Karl and Chuka. The Green Party, their vote plummeted in the recent election after a much heralded electing Annemie Paul as the leader. They're not going to be selecting a new leader. What are the future prospects for the Green Party, both in Parliament and outside? Let's start with Karl.
Start with me?
Sure, yeah.
I did write an article to say that despite everything, the terrible trials and tribulations of the Green Party, the fact that given the biases of our electoral system, they managed to elect 2 MPs is good for them, and that they can use that. And that's where they start. Those 2 MPs can act as solid spokespeople on the climate change issue and environmental issues in general. I mean, three advice to the Green Party: really focus on your core environmental policy and stay away from other things. But I mean, the fact is, my friends in the mainstream media tend to be unfair a bit to say, in way back a few elections ago, we had Linda Duncan as one of the NDP members of Parliament, and she was a genuine expert on the environment. She really knew her stuff, and there were some, when the Liberals were in opposition, they have some people like that. But the media never thought of any members that way except the Green members, especially Elizabeth May. Elizabeth May had a status in the media's mind beyond that of a politician. She was a sort of like neutral, dispassionate, qualified expert on the environment. And they would come to her that way, not treating what she said as partisan political stuff, but more as, this is the person who knows what she's talking about, and she's going to give us some kind of analysis of environmental policy. So they should play that advantage as the best they can. But the reality of the Green Party is that it is a weird grab bag. I know people who would vote Conservative or Green because they think the Green is not socialist like the NDP. They don't like socialism, so they like the Green. I know people who would consider themselves sort of anarchists, but they would vote Green. The Green is kind of it's what people want it to be. It's sort of quasi-protest vote. And many people who have this very false and unfair perception of the NDP that is completely controlled by unions and that it has an 1897 old-fashioned socialist working class view of the world and we can't support them. Oh, with the Green, they're more modern, but I'm kind of not that crazy, but the Liberals all vote for the Greens. I think the Greens have to define what they are and what they want to accomplish. And I guess they should start with their name and with their mission on the environment.
Thank you, Karl. Chuka, what do you think? What's up with the Greens?
I think that they could significantly increase their vote share if they started or engaged in a nationwide campaign of anti-capitalist industrial sabotage. That would be my recommendation.
Right on. Short and sweet. I like it. Okay. All right. And again, this has been a fantastic discussion. We're down to our last audience question, which is a good one. Well, they're all good ones, but so the Trudeau government has been implementing land claims policies established by his father in 1973 and a so-called, quote, inherent right policy imposed in 1995. All the agreements from these two main policies require surrender to, quote, assumed crown sovereignty. What do the panelists think should be done about this, since the 2021 Liberal election platform mentioned it? Let's start with Rachel on this one.
I knew you were going to start with me. This is the crux of the issue. This is the issue, is that, and what I'm saying is that Canadian government that was given, in Pampers from the Queen to John A. Macdonald, whoever was drinking in the House of Commons at the time, that governance system is flawed. I don't care if you're Mother Teresa in that system, you're not going to be effective. And what I'm saying is the land here is spiritual, is sacred. The land is what dictates what happens in North America. That's why our people are so tied to the land. And no, I'm sorry, the land doesn't have human rights, and it doesn't get to form a corporation and be a person or vote. But the land for us is where we go for direction. And when I heard you mention these environmentalists like Elizabeth May and David, and right behind him, David Suzuki, what about our people who have been here watching the climate for thousands of years? Are we not the actual experts of climate change and things that are happening in this land? And I'm sorry again, Leah, I disagree with the UNDRIP. Section 48 says, we can talk nice all the way up to Section 48. At the end, Canada can just, bend us over and slap us with a yardstick like they did in residential school. So what is the point? So until you hear from First Nation voices, these are the authentic voices that come from the ground and that have an understanding of, I've grown up around ceremonies, languages, land, and the importance. My dad read the red paper in the House of Commons to Pierre Elliott Trudeau. My dad was one of the crafters, one of the writers who wrote the red paper. He went to England to go bug Liz about coming over here or living up to the treaty. So there is a history in my own family, that legacy that I'm living up to. And I'm not stepping into that arena. I am not stepping into that, into the fort. I'm standing outside the fort with my people, and that's where I'm going to stay.
Thank you, Rachel. Why don't we go with Chuka, Karl, and we will give Leah the last word on this. So Chuka, over to you.
Yeah, my comments are very short. Abolish the monarchy, smash the crown, and castle, seize the assets. That's it, basically.
Short and sweet. Okay, Karl, over to you. You're on mute, Karl.
Okay. Speaking as the oldest person here can never remember he's on mute. Speaking as part of the settler colonial group, end extinguishment. That I would like to see that in the throne speech. We're no longer the government of Canada, the settler government of Canada, is going to tell the Indigenous people that in negotiations, the idea that to get anything, you have to extinguish all of your other potential rights. You have to renounce everything that you inherently have, end that. I mean, we go back to the James Bay Agreement, which included that, which became very painful, but that was in the 1970s. That was the beginning. We should get beyond that. And as part of that as well, order the lawyers in government to stop treating themselves as lawyers for a client, the federal government, that is in an adversarial relationship with Indigenous people, and it always has to win. And say you're mediators and negotiators and compromisers and working with people. Our goal is not always to win, especially when the victims are children.
Thank you, Karl. And the last word to Leah.
Well, I think this government needs to certainly recognize inherent rights to land. This shouldn't be, won in drawn-out court cases. I think, I know there's differing points of view, certainly with my colleague here, Rachel, online in terms of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. I don't expect colonial behaviors to change, but I do think it provides us with a good framework in terms of moving forward. But one of the things that we haven't discussed today, which is probably one of the key concerns for me, is the fact that Matthew Bernier got 800,000 votes in this past election. There is a rise in white supremacy in this country. And that rise is fueling discussions and filtering into the House of Commons in a way that is normalized, in a way that is vile. And I think if we want to watch for anything in this upcoming parliament, I think it's to defend all peoples against the rise of white supremacy. I think it's a real threat. The PPC got more votes in my riding than the Green Party. And this is not just true for my riding. If you look throughout the country, the PPC got more votes in ridings than the Green Party. So, you know, we can talk about the Green Party. Certainly they were a hot mess. They have all sorts of internal troubles. But I think we need to focus on the rise of white supremacy in this country, and we need to act accordingly.
Well, Leah, that's a really sobering, but I think very powerful note to end on. We've come to the end of our time, and I'd like to say thank you to all of the panelists. You guys were just terrific, a very animated and varied discussion today about a whole bunch of questions that are before us. So thank you so much to Leah, to Rachel and Karl, and of course Robin and I as co-hosts. We're delighted to do this, and we'd like to thank all of the folks from the audience who participated in the chat. It was a great chat going on. Off the Hill will be back next month, so be sure to sign up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca /alerts to make sure you get the invitation for the next Off the Hill. And finally, I want to thank Rabble for creating this very important space to host these discussions. And as always, if I can put in a plug for Rabble, you can help Rabble out by becoming a monthly donor at a very small amount to help Rabble, rabble.ca /donate. So thank you all to the panelists, to everybody who participated tonight for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you at the next Off the Hill. Good night.